Buddy, and welcome to the 2019 National Lead Poisoning Prevention Week webinar series. National Lead Poisoning Prevention Week is a call to bring together families and individuals, community and faith-based organizations, industry, and grantees, including state, tribal, county, and local governments, and many others. The goal is to increase lead poisoning prevention awareness in an effort to reduce childhood exposure to lead. HUD's Office of Lead Hazard Control in Healthy Homes, EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, and CDC's Lead Poisoning Prevention and Environmental Health Tracking Branch collaborate annually on this observance. The webinars are also supported by the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture and the National Healthy Homes Partnership. Please visit the National Lead Poisoning Prevention Week website at hud.gov/program_healthy_homes/NLPPW to get more information and to download the new partner information toolkit. Today's webinar is the last one we'll have this week. We've had a great week with some wonderful webinars. This is an encore presentation by two great presenters. Today's webinar is HUD's Lead Paint Safety Field Guide. The presenters are Dr. Warren Friedman, Senior Advisor to the Director, Office of Lead Hazard Control in Healthy Homes, and Bruce Haber, Division Director, Program and Regulatory Support Division, Office of Lead Hazard Control in Healthy Homes. We're pleased that you have joined us for this event. This webinar will last approximately 30 to 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for questions. At the end of the webinar, you will be given information on links to additional resources for your program. We will be recording this webinar and posting it for your viewing later if you prefer. Finally, we ask that you keep your microphone muted during the presentation. We will take questions at the end of the presentation. What we'd like you to do is there's on the GoToWebinar portal, you'll see that there's a tab that says questions. If you will type in your questions, then I will read the questions to Bruce and Warren at the end of their presentations. So welcome, Warren and Bruce, and we look forward to your webinar today.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. This is Bruce Haber speaking, and with me is Dr.
Warren Friedman.
So you can now recognize our voices, and we're going to do a little tag team here, presenting on the Lead Paint Safety Field Guide. We're going to take a little bit different tact in it this time around, because a lot of people that are on this session today will have already seen it, or used the old one. But as with all of these presentations during National Lead Poisoning Prevention Week, we do also want to talk a little bit, and we'll try to go through it fairly quickly, the background on lead and the health effects and everything else like that. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Friedman to do his little song and dance.
Thank you, Bruce. This is Warren Friedman, and I'm pleased to be here with Bruce. Also, thank you, Michael, for facilitating this event. We start off with two versions of the Lead Paint Safety Field Guide, the Spanish version on the left and the English version on the right. And we certainly welcome comments that any of you on the phone may have about either version. And I should note that on November 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to be holding a webinar in Spanish on the Lead Paint Safety Guide, and you will hear more from Bruce about that presentation. Now, the field guide was originally published by HUD, EPA, and CDC. That was back in 2001, ancient history. The current version, the 2019 version, was published by HUD, but we got our EPA and CDC colleagues to provide input. Their comments and suggestions are reflected all the way through the document. Now, we're going to get a discussion about these four topics: lead and health, the regulations, the update to the guide, and the selected work practices that I think you're going to enjoy Bruce's way of going through them. So the short history of a long history, we go back 8,500 years all the way to a small statue in Turkey that was a lead-containing object. And then 4,000 years ago, the toxic effects of lead were first recognized. And so even though 2,400 years ago, the Romans used lead in, as the slide says, everything, they were aware that there were problems, but they still went ahead and used it because lead certainly has a wide range of properties that provide utility in the objects that people use, whether it's lead as the soft metal or lead combined into compounds that get used for other purposes. So we go ahead all the way through to the 20th century AD, and in this case, we see that at the beginning of the century, Australia banned lead paint in house paint. Then in 1921, ethyl gas was something that General Motors began using, and this was to prevent engine knock. Then all the way up to 1978, the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned lead in use for house paint at a certain level. More recently, that level has dropped to even lower levels, down from 600 parts per million of lead in paint down to 90 parts per million of lead in paint. The biggest act for HUD was in 1992. It's informally known as Title 10, this Residential Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act. The title indicates that it's focusing on lead-based paint and specifically addressing the reduction of hazards from the paint. Now, we see in this chart 3 different measures of the use of lead in commerce in the United States. The first was the paint, and this is the solid green bar on the left, where the primary usage of the paint in the period covered here, starting in 1910, was in the first half of the century. And so there were ups and downs, and certainly the Great Depression, starting in 1929, drastically reduced the amount of housing that was being developed and housing that was being repainted. So the paint use dropped during the Depression, and it rose during World War II somewhat, but then continued to drop as people's understanding of lead problems from paint, and also that increased, as did the availability of alternatives to lead in paint. Titanium and other metals could be used. Now we have, on the other hand, gasoline, in which the post-war usage of lead was the primary era. And so we see that as the paint amount went down, the gasoline amount went up until in the 70s this started to drop, again reflecting increased awareness of the health effects of lead emissions from tailpipes and eventually congressional activity to decrease the use of lead in gas. There is still some gasoline that has lead aviation gas for piston engines. The prop planes can have lead. It doesn't have to, but much of it does. But in any case, there's relatively small amounts of lead in gasoline. Now, you see, based on information from the CDC, the bars for the blood lead levels, the geometric mean levels, roughly an average, and you see those going in the right direction, which is down. Now, continuing on this question of health effects, you see the bold-faced items. The first bullet for children and the first bullet for adults is there is no safe level of lead in the body for either children or adults. And you might ask, well, what about adolescents? Well, if you think of them as older children or younger adults, either way, it's the same thing, that there's no safe level of lead there. Now, during the developmental stage, the effects of lead on children in terms of issues regarding the nervous systems, the intelligence, the hearing, learning disabilities, those are well known. And the basic issue here is that calcium is chemically similar to lead in the way the body handles both, but if lead is there, and it in general should not be, then calcium can't do its work in terms of transmitting nerve signals, and the body winds up not responding in terms of learning, not responding in terms of hearing, and as a result, we have these health problems, and there are, of course, social problems, increased costs of medical treatment, increased costs of education, special education, lots of consequences for this. And there are several other effects on kids noted. For adults, the memory loss that's also related to the nerve system and the concentration, irritability, and depression. There's also nerve system issues. But there are a variety of other systems in the body that are affected by high levels of lead exposure. And you see some of those listed. Where in the body? This is a chart not for us to go through in detail here, but since you have this slide set for reference, you can see there are effect locations all over the body, whether it's in the child or in the adults. One of the things that I found useful when I was doing worker training for adults, especially crews of men, was the thing that's at the bottom right there. Decreased sex drive and sperm count. That catches people's attention. So that's a place to get people to be engaged. Similarly, I've found that in training women, the spontaneous miscarriage also attracts attention. So even though there's a somewhat inaccurate concept out there that, oh, lead is just a kid's issue, when you get those points raised, you get people to liven up in your sessions on the importance of lead safety. Now, going to lead regulations, as I was indicating, there are worker safety issues in terms of lead exposure. We're going to discuss here not the OSHA standards, we're going to discuss the HUD standards and the EPA standards. There are two standards for HUD, and the first of those, lead disclosure rule, is also a standard for EPA. It's a joint standard. And then the RRP rule and the lead-based paint activities rule, sometimes also called the abatement rule, those are EPA standards. Now, the lead safe housing rule covers federally assisted housing, and the largest provider of that is HUD. Well, what we at HUD do is incorporate the EPA standards that you see there by reference into the lead safe housing rule, so that for assisted housing that is pre-78, the EPA rules have to be complied with because the HUD rules say the owners have to comply with the EPA rules. So it's one big happy federal family in terms of the rulemaking and also the applicability. Now, the lead disclosure rule requirements, that's the top rule that was on the previous slide. This is basically designed by Congress, and then EPA and HUD are implementing the rule to give information to people so that they can make decisions. So before a family signs a lease or before a family buys a home, if this is pre-78 home, the family is provided a pamphlet. The pamphlet on the left, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, or informally Protect Your Family, which is the lead disclosure pamphlet. And there's a specific warning statement describing the problems that lead can cause in the lease or in the sales agreement of the pre-78 home. The seller or the lessor has to disclose any known information about lead-based paint or about lead-based paint hazards, and this can also include work that was done for lead hazard control purposes that has to be disclosed, and the results of that, if there are clearance tests, have to be disclosed. And as I indicated, all this is done before the contract is signed. That way, if a family wishes not to get a sales contract go through or not to get a lease contract go through, they can pull out before they are committed to the lease or the sale. Now, the lead-safe housing rule, as I mentioned, these are for assisted housing. And the four nice little graphics here, look, act, clear, and tell, give you the high-level picture of what the rule covers. And the idea here is that we're going to be looking at a property, again, pre-1978 housing that's assisted, and then taking action based on what we see. If there is lead hazard control work done and it's more than a very small amount, then the project has to be cleared, in other words, tested for the presence of dust and debris at the end of the project and for the presence of high levels of lead in the dust on the floors, the windowsills, and window troughs. It has to have none of that before the family can be allowed back in. And then the last of the graphics is that we have the landlord or the contractor, depending what the situation is, tell the family, here's what you found. Or here's what we found, so that you, the family, know how to deal with this. Now, for the EPA's rule, the renovation, repair, and painting rule, they are on a similar track to what HUD is on. They want to make sure, our EPA colleagues want to make sure that kids are protected from lead dust associated with these activities. And this rule has been in effect for almost a decade. And it has procedures for notifying the family beforehand, such as with the Renovate Right pamphlet, for doing the work properly, and for having firms who are certified renovation firms do the work, have a certified renovator. This is a person who's been through a one-day training class overseeing the work, and then the workers themselves can either be certified renovators or for EPA, they can get on-the-job training from the certified renovator. And I should note that for HUD-assisted housing, we require that all of the people doing the work, the supervisor and the staff workers, be certified renovators. Now, there's the lead-based paint activities rule, and this deals with lead-based paint inspection, lead risk assessment, and lead abatement. That's lead-based paint abatement or lead-based paint hazard abatement. And the structure here is that the firms doing this work have to be certified by EPA or an EPA authorized state, and then the individuals performing these services have to be trained and certified, again, by EPA or an EPA authorized state. And the training providers themselves have to be accredited, and the EPA or EPA authorized state does the accreditation and teach approved curricula. And so EPA, under congressional direction, has encouraged states to run their own certification programs. They go to EPA beforehand to have EPA review their plans and see if their plan for carrying out their certification is acceptable. If so, then EPA authorize them to run their certification programs. Now, the field guide begins here.
It does.
And I'm going to turn it back over to Bruce. So, Bruce, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much, Warren. Now we're trying to go into the meat and potatoes of what we're here for today, and that's to go through the lead paint safety field guide. In previous editions of this webinar, we've talked about how it was constructed and some of the basics about the items in it. But now we're going to I want to kind of wander through the procedures that are outlined in the field guide for doing some very common activities. But before I jump into that, I do want to remind everybody that we also have the field guide published in Spanish, and for the first time ever on November 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to host a webinar and present the field guide to hopefully a large Spanish audience. You will be receiving more information for signing up for that webinar as we get closer to the date. So we ask for your help in disseminating that information so that other people who wouldn't necessarily be part of this English version, but also might be a lot of the people that are doing some of the work have a chance to see what the field guide contains. So today, what I hope to go through is like, who is the potential users, from maintenance to homeowners. How should the publication be used? I'm going to walk through some of the activities that are laid out there. And then how does this relate to HUD materials on the RRP, but also how does it relate to the HUD, not EPA's materials on the RRP, and HUD's materials on the Lead Safe Housing Rule. And then we have key points to consider. So on the left side of this page is an example of one of the pages in the field guide. And it's like, who should follow this guide and then why? So we have a listing of various people who might find this a very valuable document. Maintenance contractors, building maintenance staff, property managers, my favorite because I am one, a homeowner, public housing staff, and then volunteers. And basically anybody who's doing maintenance in a pre-78 house that may or may not have lead-based paint. These are all very, very good procedures to follow. And if you are being contracted to work in a pre-78 house or in a child-occupied facilities, most of the procedures outlined here also would apply for a renovation, repair, and painting rule type project that's covered by the EPA. So what we want to do, the lead paint safety field guide is broken into different sections. We have the beginning, which is all the basics. Then we have what to do before you start the work. This is the most critical part of getting a job going, is how you get things set up. Then you actually have the work, whatever it might be. Then at the end of the job, there's the standard by which you will be judged as to the quality and completeness of the job. And then further on into the field guide, we have other resources, so links to other agencies such as EPA or OSHA. We have topics like respiratory protection, what you need to think about when you're doing jobs. So what we have here, starting off with the basics, within the field guide, we kind of start by explaining that you got to figure out the cause of the paint deterioration. If there's a roofing leak and you don't deal with that before correcting the deteriorated paint and plaster, or if there's a plumbing leak or a heating system leak inside a wall and you fix it in the summer when the heating system's off, everything looks great, but in the fall when the heating system comes on, the steam starts to leak, the wall deteriorates again. So it's very, very important to identify the cause of the paint of deterioration. And then you need to set up the work area. And depending on the type of work, how difficult it is, how dirty it might be, there's different ways that a work area might be set up. At the conclusion of that, you've got to clean up. You have to clear it, and there's multiple ways to clear up a site. You could do the old-fashioned construction site broom clean, which is not acceptable to HUD or EPA. Or for HUD, we would do a clearance testing. And for EPA under the RRP, we do cleaning verification. And the book also has, and this is very, very important for people who are going to do repetitive actions in a house, such as major renovations. There are high dust jobs where you're getting rid of a lot of paint from surfaces, such as from windows or doors, but you want to reinstall the doors. And so we have how to build a dust containment. And so we're going to try to go through some of that stuff. So we do have, in the beginning, some principles to remember. They're found in the field guide. We presume there is lead-based paint. It is very important that you check and are familiar with the federal and state regulations. And if you are paying somebody to do the work, or you're part of a firm who's being paid to do the work, be sure that they're properly certified for the type of work that they're doing. And by that, I mean like EPA renovation, repair, and painting, or if you're doing abatement work, they need to be the state or EPA abatement stuff. We looked to and hope for the goal of avoid creating dust. We also want to protect occupants and belongings. We want to clean up. We want the surfaces that we repair to be maintainable. So certain surfaces, we want to make them smooth and cleanable. And that gets to the final thing, that we want to be clean when we're finished, and we want to make sure that the family has the ability to clean up and maintain a clean house when they're living there. So throughout the manual, we do have visual representations, and sure I got the right slideshow here. We have we have visual representations in drawings such as leaking through the roof, and also things that you should not do, such as using a belt sander on a bathtub in order to remove the paint and then reglaze it. So each section throughout the book provides guidance and things about correcting the problem, setting up the work area. We always refer to different, whether it's interior or exterior. Federal funds, we refer you to page 51 for cleanup, for clearance, and checking the work. And then for high dust jobs, as I mentioned, maybe you need to make a high dust job area, a special containment area that you can control ventilation and the migration of dust to other parts. So today what I wanted to do, as I said, it was a slightly different picture of the lead paint safety field guide, is I wanted to pick 3 very typical operations that are done. Most homeowners either do them themselves or they have contractors do stuff to come in because it's part of normal wear and tear. These are activities that should be going on all the time. And so I picked 3. Preparing a room or a whole unit for painting, common thing to do. I like to paint a bedroom. You have a unit to turn over as you prepare for a new occupant. There's also the times that you have old wood windows that are coated with lead-based paint, but they need service. These windows were not designed to be, indestructible, lasting forever, but because of the quality of the wood from the 20s and the 30s, these windows will last for a great length of time if they are maintained. And the same thing goes for a lot of our old, big, heavy wood doors. There are problems. Some things will happen. They need to be repaired, but they need to be worked on, but they need to be worked on in a manner that does not leave a mess of lead hazards behind. So, in the lead paint field guide, there is a section for interior surface preparation. This is a really common thing. I'm going to paint a room. So here's the problem. The wall or ceiling is sound. Everything looks good, but it's holes. My daughter, she put all these pinholes and all that in the wall. There's some uneven surfaces, so I want to try to flatten those out, sand them out, and there's some flaking and peeling paint. So the solution is what we always do. We prep the walls for painting. Because if you don't prep the walls, your next paint job is not going to do a very good job. It's not going to last. But we want to use methods that create the minimum amount of dust possible. So we have over here on the right side a picture from the lead paint safety field guide of setting up the work area. So we restrict access. We put up the danger lead work area. We put down plastic, a floor covering, and the minimum area is usually 6 feet out in either direction from the areas that you're working. So if you're doing a whole room, you'd hopefully get the furniture out of it and then put plastic down on the whole floor, but if you have to leave furniture in it, then you'd probably move it to the middle, cover that with plastic, and then send the plastic out to the walls. So you set up the work area, then you remove the deteriorated paint. You use wet scraping, so a little soap and water goes a long way to wet scrape any loose or peeling paint. At that point, you sand and then use a wet abrasive sponge. There's many varieties out there that you can use to help feather out edges, irregular patches, or holes. And then you want to clean the wall, particularly in a kitchen where there's a heavy oil accumulation on the walls and ceilings, because no matter what kind of primer you use, what kind of paint you use, if you have walls covered with oil and grease, eventually it's going to peel off itself. So, after washing, we have a little arrow with a finger pointing at an important issue, and you'll find these important issues throughout the field guide that allow the surface to dry before you do priming. And that's important to do. Prime the surface. I don't know if anybody can see that or not. Prime the surface using high-grade primer, and then apply top coats. Use 1 or 2 coats as necessary, whatever color paint you like. And then after you finish doing the painting, you've got to make sure your cleaning is done. So we refer you on to page 51, how to do cleanup, page 56 in the field guide, how to check your work. And then at the conclusion of it, depending on your choice or the terms of the contract or the funding source, if it's a HUD or a private thing, cleaning verification according to the RRP, or clearance testing according to the EPA. According to HUD, sorry. So here's on page 51. I made the image a little bit smaller up in the right-hand corner. If you got a big screen, you can see it fairly well. But at the end of the job, you want to pick up as you go, put trash in heavy-duty plastic bags, vacuum up the work area with a HEPA vacuum cleaner, clean it up frequently so you don't have a large accumulation. That also prevents you from tracking things around the way. Clean all your tools at the end of the day, and where do you do that? In the kitchen sink? No, you should have a workstation. And then because lead is involved and the OSHA regulations require you to have a washing place where you can wash your hands before you take a break. So you dispose of and clean up all your personal protective equipment. Do you need a respirator? That's dependent upon the job. And then you need to remind residents to stay out of the work area, which can be hard, particularly if you go home at the end of the day, even though you got the door closed and the signs up. So for HEPA vacuuming and misting and scrubbing, you clean the walls starting at the ceiling, working down to the floor by either vacuuming with a HEPA vacuum or wiping with a damp cloth. And I do highly recommend that you allow the paint to completely dry before you wipe down the walls with a wet, damp cloth. So then HEPA vacuum all the remaining surfaces and objects in the room, work the farthest corner back toward the entrance on your way out. Then you got to check your job. You want to, at the end of the job, be sure the repairs are done properly, no dust, no paint chips. If it's exterior, that the soil is clean of paint chips. Perform the cleaning verification or take a dust wipe sample. So why is this important? Why is it important to check your work? And we have this big long checklist you can see on the page in the upper right-hand corner. It's on page 56. So not correcting the condition causing the damage will mean it'll return again. So I mentioned earlier about steam leak in a heating system, a plumbing leak, a roofing leak. You know, you have a long drought and you have a roof leak. Yeah, you can fix the ceiling and it stays for a while. And then someday it's going to rain or the snow is going to build up on the roof and it's going to leak again and the ceiling is going to fall in. So, and not following field guide, especially cleanup, you can end up spreading dust, which could endanger children and other occupants of the unit, and that could end up a liability of a lawsuit if you've done work and someone comes down with lead exposure or an elevated blood levels at some later time shortly after you've concluded the work. So the next job that I wanted to look at, which is kind of a common one, is windows. And windows, the old wood ones, if you take care of them, they will last for hundreds of years. If they're allowed to deteriorate, then probably the best bet is to replace them, which is a major business nowadays of replacing windows. But I want to go through some of the nomenclature because we have these drawings within the field guide that actually describes the different parts. And some of the parts are important, particularly to HUD, because we're always talking about friction and impact surfaces. So here in a window, we have the casing. It's the wood trim that goes around the window. The wood trim is not a friction or impact surface, but it's a decorated surface that doesn't, even if it has lead, oftentimes is left because it's not prone to friction or weather or impact. Then we also have the top and bottom sashes, which slide up and down inside the jamb. Now these are friction surfaces, and so we typically want to take good care of them and make sure that the friction is minimized. And so we want to, this might be something that would be maintained if we wanted to keep the windows, and it's also probably the number one reason windows are replaced. Then we have the exterior sill, which is also called the window well or the window trough, the space between where the sashes come down to, and between the regular wooden sashes and the exterior storm windows. We call that the well, and that's a great place for lead paint on the outside of the window to fall down and accumulate. And it's a terrible place, but kids get exposed there as they look outside. So here's all the different parts. You got the casing, the jambs, the stops, the parting beads. You got inside stool or interior windowsill. There's an apron underneath it. Lots of stuff go into it. And you can see by the pictures on the right that we do actually show you how to take some of these windows apart. So, which is what we're going to do here. We're going to talk a little bit about window maintenance. So once again, go back to page 15, set up the work area. Our problem here is the window sticking. The paint on the window is flaking. So what we want to do is kind of pull the sash out, scrape, plane it, repaint it, and then reinstall it because I like the architectural treatment. I like the way it looks, so we can actually do that. So there are special tools, and there's instructions which come in the field guide, including using a window opener. It's actually razor knives or box cutters work very, very well for that point. And basically, you cut the paint where the pieces of wood are connected, and then you peel those pieces out. One of the most important things, which I put down here at the bottom of this slide, is work wet. So a little spray bottle full of soap and water goes a long way to controlling dust. So then you want to take the sash over to someplace where you can work on it, so you can be careful and you can control the dust and everything. And we do say set up a dust room. We have instructions on page 49 of the field guide how to build a special area. It has the HEPA vacuum. It has all the tools. And so it's a very nice way. Sometimes if you're renovating your own house, you set it up in the garage. So old-time window treatment. We have problems with the storm window. Traps water behind the frame, causing paint deterioration and damage to the exterior sill. It begins to rot out. It's a pretty simple solution, is you need to drill a drain hole in the aluminum triple track storm window so the water can drain out. And then what you want to do is install a clean, smooth layer, and aluminum coil stock works wonderful. And I believe we have instructions on how to do that here. Over here on the left side is an example from the field guide itself. And you can see that we're talking about replacing or reinstalling the counterweights. These are old people. Anybody that grew up in a house built in the 20s has probably seen these big iron or lead ballasts inside the wall holding on by a chain or a cotton rope, which sometimes, due to light, weather, and age, eventually breaks, and now the sash won't go up. So we do discuss that. And the reason that we do that, as I pointed out, is some of these windows are really architecturally pretty. On the left, we have the double window, and you notice there's 4 small panes up on top, then 2 bigger panes, and then a single pane down below. The sides of the windows are very attractive. Inside, after all the paint was taken care of, it was repaired, and now the windows operate. Both upper and lower sash can be moved. So another common problem is the door rubs or sticks. So the door is scraping on the latch, so this becomes a friction or an impact issue. Or the door is crushing the jamb on the latch side. There's not enough clearance. So we give a diagram with all the different components named on a door system. Once again, we have the door casings, much like a window casing. It's not an impact or friction surface, but we do have the latch, and we have the panels and the door jamb, strike plate. Those are impact and friction places. So the solution in this particular case is predicted to be plane the edges of the door so it's a little bit smaller. It operates smoothly and does not rub. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that each time that you put a layer of paint on something, that surface is getting bigger. And sooner or later in our older housing, we've painted the doors and the door jambs enough times that they don't fit together anymore. And so that's where this planing can be, but this can also be a high dust job, so you got to be careful with it. So it sticks. So once again, we go back to page 15. Set up the work area. So you're putting the plastic down, you're sealing it off, putting up the signs. Check the door, grasp the knob. Try to move the door up and down. If the hinges are loose, the door is going to move. Maybe that's all that's wrong. And so one of the old ways to take out some of the screws, and you can clear the paint from, take the screws out and then clean them off, fill the hole with toothpicks or dowels, re-drill them so that you have a good solid surface and screws can come in, and then that'll help straighten out the door. So if you take the door off and you can take it over to a work area, such as we talked about a high dust job on page 49, you can use a hand plane to smooth off or take off thin layers of the door so that it will eventually fit into the space. Don't use a power sander. Belt sander works pretty good, but it creates an awful lot of dust, and according to the EPA and HUD as prohibited methods, you can do that as long as you have it equipped with a HEPA vacuum. I will tell from personal experience, a belt sander still makes an awful lot of dust. Then you can recut the hinge gains. That's where the cut in the door where the hinges actually fit in. You want to seal all the edges of the door, particularly the top and the bottom. If you don't do that, the door picks up moisture in the air, particularly in the summertime. It expands. Once again, as the door expands, it will fill up the space and become a friction and impact, or a friction surface, once again, not fitting in the door opening. Throughout the book, we also go on and talk about many other options. So we talk about stairs, or as I mentioned on the windows, we've got the counterweights. We have very important things about vacuuming carpets, another example of when you're vacuuming carpets, you got to do it slowly. Take your time so that you get as much dust out of it. Carpets are a massive sink. Removing carpet can be a very high dust job because of all the dirt and debris that's down underneath and in the pad. So we have a lot of information throughout the field guide on other types of surfaces, activities, different ways to clean things. There's as many different ways to do things as we could fit into the field guide we've placed in there. And we've tried to include images and everything else like that. So we did update some of completing the job information toward the rear of the field guide in order to accommodate the EPA's renovation, repair, and painting rule. So we want to check the work, visual inspection, cleaning verification, taking dust wipes, and other stuff like that. We have pretty good instructions for cleaning verification, including after completing the verification, the certified renovator, we tell you who has to do it. And if it's free of dust, debris, and residue, then they'll do the cleaning verification using, I think it's a Swiffer swab, something like that. We also talk about the HUD clearance levels, and I want to point out that the lead hazard standards the EPA has for floors and window sills will be dropping to the levels that I have posted here as of January 6, 2020. And it's currently under lead hazard control grants. These are the standards, but now the new hazard standards the EPA has out, they're out and will go into effect in January. And then why it matters again, it's important. I gave a little important arrow here: maintain required certification and training. If you're an abatement worker or abatement supervisor, if you're an RRP certified renovator, keep those certifications up to date. Remember why it matters: if you fail to correct the conditions causing the damage or deterioration results, the repairs won't last. Work that fails to follow the recommendations may cause lead hazards from dust and paint chips that go beyond the work area and can endanger children. Dust and paint chips left behind due to bad cleaning can once again be a danger to children, dogs, pets, cats, and anybody else, probably adults too. And then contractors, checking your work improves the quality of the job and reduces your risk of lawsuits, but also is more likely to increase the amount of referrals that you receive for somebody else. Some additional changes we put into we simplify the use. So we've updated the resources, we've updated the glossary, we've provided more information such as various technical topics, including different kinds of respirators. These are all toward the end of it. We do go over the pre-renovation education requirements. So within this small 70-page little manual that will fit in your toolbox is pretty much everything that you need to remind yourself of how to go about doing things in a safe manner. So the reason why, before, here's a house, after, another house. I don't know about you, but the one on the right, I'd much rather bring my kids up in. And then I want to remind everybody, because we're coming to the conclusion of this little session, we'll be taking your questions in just a moment, that on November 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to present the field guide in Spanish, and we're going to work on trying to develop some more of the actual work practices so that those can be explained well. And so with that, you can learn more about us, the Office of Lead Hazard Control, and then we have our contact information. And lead regulations at HUD.gov is always a good way to get emails to and from us. And then we also have the lead regulations phone number, 202-402-7698. And I believe we have time for some questions.
You do. So I want to remind everybody, you don't have any questions at this point. I know there's a lot to cover, and there are some people that are on this webinar that probably are familiar, but I want to remind everybody, if you have some questions for Bruce and Warren, especially if it's about something they may not have presented, but it's in the guide that you have questions on, please feel free to type your questions out in the questions window, and then I will ask them to Bruce and Warren. So we do have our first question. Which is, let me see if I can pull it up here. How can we get access to the 2019 HUD field guide?
We're going to provide a link to you, Michael.
Okay.
And you can send it out with a thank you to everybody that participated in this show.
Perfect. Glad to do that.
And
Go ahead.
Warren, supplement what Bruce says. If people absolutely have to have it instantly, even before Michael can get the specific reference, the HUD.gov/lead page, at the bottom there's a link to outreach and publications. And when you click on that, at the bottom is the field guide in English and Spanish. So you can get it right away.
Fantastic.
And,
go ahead.
And then one last thing, if you want a hard copy, we did get a few printed. I'm not sure how many we still have. And I believe we're going to try to get some more printed this year. So
good to know.
Us, regulations, and we'll see if we can get you one.
So the next question that came in, does the field guide address pre-cleanup before beginning a lead hazard reduction job if paint is found on the ground?
I don't remember if it specifically addresses that, but it would address it in the cleaning at the conclusion of the work.
Yes, and this is Warren supplementing that. The general idea, for example, in terms of putting down plastic sheeting under the work area, if you're going to do that, it makes certain sense to get any dust and debris and paint chips, for example, cleaned up on the floor before you put plastic on it, because after you are finished with the project, you clean up the plastic, you remove the plastic, you then have to clean up the floor. So one way or another, you have to clean up the floor. That's a very good question, so thank you very much. We'll make sure that we have some written guidance on that.
Yeah, and I was looking at the setup of the work area, and we do talk about the plastic and cleaning up and everything. On page 15, remove objects from the work area, drapes, curtains, furniture, rugs, cover and seal objects that can't be moved. But we did not specifically address pre-cleaning, which that's a good question, yes. That's something maybe we can work on addressing.
While we're waiting for another question, again, please feel free to type in your questions. We'll probably give them a few more minutes for questions. But one of the things I'd like to tell everybody that's in attendance today is the notice, the official advertising notice for the webinar that Bruce and Warren are talking about, where we're doing the same one in Spanish, is actually going to come out fairly soon. And what we ask everybody to do, if possible, is get the word out for this. This is a audience that we have not actually done a webinar for. And I know there's a lot of people in the industry that may have Spanish as their primary language. And so this is definitely an opportunity. So if you have an organization or a lead program and you have social media or a newsletter, we'll want you to, if you can, advertise this to make sure that we can get the word out for that webinar. So the next question is it a requirement to carry the field guide when work or clearance is being done?
No. The field guide is, as it's in the title, a guide. There's no requirement that you carry it. It's not like a certification or a license that needs to be present at the job site.
Yes, and the guide was intentionally made small so it could fit into a work bag, but it does not have to be there. It also is useful for supervisors to have, so that as something comes up that a worker may not be doing right, the supervisor can say, here's a way to do it right, and here are some pictures that you can look
at. Thank you for that answer. Another question. I know you addressed this a little bit when you were talking about the children occupied spaces, but does this only apply to residential? Are there different requirements for commercial or government facilities?
Well, interesting question. The focus of this is on residences. It certainly is usable for these child occupied facilities, a term referring to places where children under 6 frequent, even if they don't live there. And the child care center is typically used, or a preschool, things like that. The substance applies. A room is a room, a building is a building. So you can make things safe by using the practices in the field guide whether it's government owned or privately owned or assisted or unassisted, they're widely applicable. You know, when you're there looking at a window and figuring out how you're going to get the sash out, the window doesn't care who owns the building.
That's a good point. Okay, so one last question we'll take. This is a real lengthy one, but a really good question here. Encapsulation is an abatement method. However, there are contractors on federally assisted projects that use encapsulants instead of paint for paint stabilization tasked with costs under $25K. This puts them at potential risk for noncompliance if they are RRP contractors and not abatement contractor workers. What is HUD's message to its grantees regarding the use of encapsulants?
Well, let me start off, and Bruce can weigh in as well. By grantees, I believe the questioner is asking about HUD's lead hazard control grantees, and we can go beyond if the scope of that is also larger. Encapsulation and enclosure are accepted abatement methods, and if the practices are used, they can also be interim control methods. Interim controls are not systems that are guaranteed to last for 20 years or more, but they can be used if they're used right. If they are used, then an ongoing lead-based paint maintenance program, which includes regular visual assessments to determine if the encapsulation or enclosure is still working properly, and then treating the surfaces if they are not, is important. And in HUD-regulated spaces, the visual assessments have to occur annually, plus at any turnover of a rental unit from one renter to another renter. So there are requirements for HUD-assisted, and it can also be guidance for unassisted housing and also for non-housing. The idea that, again, a building is a building, so safe practices can be applied more widely. Bruce, anything to supplement?
I would just say that, because the way the question was phrased, it could be, just regular HUD-assisted rehabilitation, because under 25, as you pointed out, lead hazards can be repaired using interim controls, and using an encapsulant instead of, Sherwin-Williams paint is perfectly fine. So it can be done. Encapsulants can be used as an interim control as well as the permanent abatement method outlined in renovations in excess of $25,000 under the lead safe housing rule.
Thank you for that answer. I know it was a challenging question from the standpoint of, gets into some specific methods that, may or may not be covered in the guide in the way that the grantees, would understand that question. So I think we're at the end of the questions. I don't see any more questions, and I know we're just right on time. I want to take this opportunity to thank Bruce and Warren for this wonderful presentation. This is the last one of National Lead Poisoning Prevention Week. Keep in mind that we will be back next year, same week in October, to do this again. Also, in June, we will be doing webinars for National Healthy Homes Month. And again, we do appreciate you getting the word out in November for the Spanish version of today's presentation. So at this point, I will be stopping the webinar, and I appreciate everybody attending today's webinar.